Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams.
Thank you so much, and I want to both thank NYU and the McSilver Institute for having this discussion. I policed in this area when I was a lieutenant. I was here, and this is the 88th precinct, and I watched BAM evolve into this major cultural district. But I recall when I left the police department, I think about the joke I talk about all the time, the caterpillar looking up at the butterfly and say, "You will never get me in one of those," you know, without the reality that we all evolve. And I'm amazed at now that I go through this transformation of trying to be a butterfly, I'm trying to figure out why was I crawling in the first place. And this is really what trauma is all about. And one of the most important transformational experiences that I encountered was through meditation and learning that oftentimes we treat our physical body without understanding that there's an anatomy to our spirit. And if we do not also nourish our spiritual anatomy, then we are only getting it half right. We can't go to the gym and just operate on one body part and expect to have a healthy core. We must operate on the entire body. And that's why I think when we talk about the trauma of racism, it has become a luxury for those who are in economically challenging communities to understand that it's about the spiritual being as well as the physical being. And if we are only treating trauma in a traditional fashion, and modern medicine has not really embraced how we need to operate on the spiritual being, and it's more than just going to church or the mosque or synagogue. It's going deeper. It's finding your purpose, and it's allowing people to understand that racism may exist, but if you create this holistic universe that you could absorb yourself in, that it builds the defense mechanism, and your spiritual mind become the white blood cells that fight and destroy racism upon contact. And if we don't have those conversations of pushing the envelope and not look for quick fixes and not believe that we can give the Brownsvilles of our globe the true wholeness of becoming whole, then we're going to miss the mark. And I just want to commend NYU because our halls of academia must explore these issues. Research and development needs to be more than finding the next version of the iPhone. How do we do research and continue to develop the most imperative, smart device we have, and this is this human experience. And that's what I want to do in Borough Hall. I don't want to build buildings anymore. I don't want to have a legacy of building a Barclays Center or another tall tower. I want to build people. I want people to find themselves, find their purpose, find their inner core, and become, to borrow from Snapple, I want them to become made of the best stuff on earth, and we can do it in Brooklyn. Thank you very much.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Borough President Adams. We really appreciate you taking the time to stop by here and lend your support. I wanted to share with you, as the Borough President asked me about this, he said, exactly how did McSilver even come about? And I'm figuring some of you are even wondering about that and about that wacky name too. So let me share this with you. As part of the transformative gift that Martin and Connie Silver gave to the Silver School when they renamed it the Silver School of Social Work. Connie Silver, a social worker herself, said, you know what, I'd like to plant the seeds. I'd like to plant the seeds of an institute that focused specifically on issues of poverty. And what she realized is that I think she knew, and what we've all seen, is that the seeds that she's planted have blossomed and grown into an institute that's making a real change, that's making a change on a state level, that's making a change on a national level and on a global level. One of the things that I think sets McSilver apart, although I think there are many, but I know we're time limited, one of the very important things I think that sets McSilver apart is that as a poverty institute, we recognize the interconnectedness between poverty and race. You cannot understand poverty without taking a look at structural racism and oppression. To do so is not even looking at half of the story. So that's why this particular forum and this panel is so important to today's discourse in understanding the root causes of poverty. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you one of the Silver School's finest faculty members and our moderator for today. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Stacey Barringer.
Thank you, Gary, for that very nice introduction. As Gary said, I'm Dr. Stacey Barringer. I'm an assistant professor at the Silver School of Social Work and a faculty fellow with the McSilver Institute. I also want to thank Dr. Mary McKay, who gave me the opportunity to moderate this panel today. When Dr. McKay first asked me to moderate this panel, my initial reaction was, no, not me. This is not my area of expertise. This is not what I study in my research. I'm a mental health services researcher, and I look at the intersection between the mental health and the criminal justice system. And as I spoke with her and started thinking about this, I realized that while I don't look at racism and trauma specifically, all of the work that I do is couched in racism and trauma, especially when we talk about mass incarceration and the criminal justice system in this country. So I think for me, it was a bit of self-reflection and also sort of a call to the academy that we need to be more explicit about how race informs the research that we do and the work that we do. So when I talk to people who have been incarcerated, even though I don't focus on their incarceration experiences, I'm more interested in reentry and them coming out and what are the services and supports they need as they make that transition back into the community. But inevitably, people want to talk about what happened to them while they were incarcerated. I think it's because I create a safe space for them and that they know I'm someone who cares and listens, that it creates this opportunity for them to talk about it, because there aren't many places that we give people to talk about these types of experiences that they have. Too often it's easy in our colorblind or post-racial society to ignore the role of race. But race needs to be made explicit in our research and our conversations with each other, hopefully like this conversation that we're going to have here today. We've set up these institutions that tell people of color they are worthless and under which they have horrible experiences. This happens in prisons and jails. This happens in welfare offices. This happens in emergency rooms. This happens in homeless shelters. This happens in psychiatric hospitals. But this also happens in communities where schools perform poorly, where there's not access to affordable quality food, where you can be stopped by the police at any time for any reason, where children only see their futures intertwined with criminal activity. All of these aggressions and microaggressions are built on implicit and explicit biases that have an impact on people of color. As practitioners, policymakers, and researchers, we need to be aware of the potential for racial structures in our society that produce a collective trauma among people of color, and we need to think about this and its impact on the work that we do every day. But the aim here is not to pathologize a whole race of people. We must also understand that these conditions provide a context for developing resiliency and strength and creativity. And as Brooklyn Borough President Adams said, to build people. Our panel here today consists of individuals who bring this perspective to the work they do, and I'm delighted to be here today and to be our guide and listen to what they have to say. Our first panelist has shown a commitment to public service and advocacy throughout her life. From working with families to reform the child welfare system, to her role as legislative director with City Council member Albert Vann, City Council speakers Gifford Miller and Christine Quinn, as well as former Brooklyn Borough President Marty Markowitz. In these positions, she's played a part in enacting legislative reforms that improve the lives of low-income families and individuals. In her current role as Associate Director for Strategic Partnerships and Community Engagement at the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research, she's able to combine the Institute's research on families and children with her experience in city government to produce policy briefs and advocate in a more informed way for underserved communities, families, and individuals in the New York City area and nationally. I am pleased to introduce Dottie Lebron.
Thank you all for being here this afternoon. But let me go ahead and introduce myself, and I'll also just say at the outfront, at the start of this, that I am a little nervous. This is pretty much my first panel in this type of forum, so bear with me if I seem a little bit nervous. I'll just say that.
See?
So I'm just very pleased to be here. And at this time, we know it's such an important time. There's such an opportunity for each of us to to come together and to collaborate and to have such an important dialogue around race, such an important issue. The Black Lives Matter campaign is just so inspiring in spite of the fact that the circumstances upon which it was derived being so sad, but also being so true in terms of what is happening in this country and what has been happening in this country for so long. And so I just feel very fortunate to be able to be a part of this panel and to have the opportunity to talk to each of you. I know that I'm in a room with a group that is just as committed as I am to helping people and to creating change. And there is a need for change. And I'd like to start out by thanking each and every one in this room that had any role in the Black Lives Matter campaign, because what happened in terms of the death of Mike Brown at the hands of white police officers, or with Eric Garner, this has been happening for years, for many, many years, generations. And usually it's the communities and the families that are upset and calling for a change and for justice. But to see everyday Americans standing up and coming together and saying no, for me is very inspiring, and it gives me the hope that we can go forward together in doing the work that we all need to do. So I just would like to start there and say thank you to each of you. And I'll move forward and talk about my role on this panel. Part of the reason I've been asked to participate in this panel has to do with my role in helping to draft the brief that you should have in front of you, which is called Facts Matter, Black Lives Matter, the Trauma of Racism. And so I'm going to walk us through the brief, which addresses a number of concepts that I think we have some understanding of, but we are in a process at McSilver. We work very collaboratively at McSilver, so we thought that as we began to look at this concept of racism as trauma, that it made sense to bring it here to our symposium to allow each of you to help us to shape this concept. So what we have done is we have developed a brief that is a three-part brief, and the first section looks at a number of ways that Black and brown boys are affected by racism and oppression in this country. And one of the ways that they are affected, which we're very clear about, is through education and educational disparities. So within the brief, we delve into that particular piece. And I should say, I began talking about the Black Lives Matter campaign, but in part, the McSilver Institute began its work in developing this brief in response to that national outcry, which presented the perfect opportunity for us to come out and discuss these issues in the special way that we do at McSilver, since we are an institute that addresses the root causes and consequences of poverty, but understanding very clearly that race is very much related to that. And so I will walk you a little bit through it. And as I said, the brief looks at racism as trauma. And we look at the social and economic consequences of racism historically and across generations. And we liken the impact of it in the lives of people of color to trauma. And so as such, when we began to do that and looking at racism as trauma, McSilver began to join a discussion, an academic discussion that has been underway. There is a body of work that looks at racism and trauma, and much of that has been focused with looking at the psychological and health impacts of racism, particularly with psychology scholars have been calling for ways to adapt treating clients that face crises related to racist incidents. There's also a wide body of work that examines the relationship of racism to disease prevalence amongst populations that have been historically subjugated. But, doing that research in looking at the concept of racism as trauma, we recognize that in addition to the psychological and health implications of it, that there was a need to depict the totality of the harm inflicted by racism to people of color within the society with respect to the social and economic position that they're within. And I should say that we looked at young black boys and as the group that's most specifically impacted. And so within this brief, we augment a clinical definition of trauma and in defining the trauma of racism, and I'm going to read that definition to you with the hopes that it can help inform our dialogue. The trauma of racism refers to the cumulative negative impact of racism within the lives of people of color, encompassing the emotional, psychological, health, economic, and social effects of multi-generational and historical trauma. When repetitive and unresolved, these experiences rooted in racism can create severe emotional pain and distress that can overwhelm a person's and a community's ability to cope, creating feelings of powerlessness. So, and that trauma of racism is exemplified in the various racial disparities in education, health, and in the criminal justice system participation. But particularly within this brief, we posit that the educational disparities that affect young boys of color, which we commonly refer to as the achievement gap, we posit within this brief that the achievement gap is one of the consequences of the trauma of racism. And that's saying something, because there is a debate underway with respect to the achievement gap. And you have, depending on the school of thought, there are different thoughts about why it exists. But we're saying outright in this position paper that that we believe that it's one of the consequences of the trauma of racism. And in that light, we highlight the dehumanizing effect of educational systems for some Black and brown students. And we cite the work of June Cara Christian, who connects education, racism, and trauma in her book, which is called Understanding the Black Flame and Multi-Generational Educational Trauma. So we cover a lot within this brief, and I'm just speaking about the section that I wrote. There's actually 3 sections, and I wrote section 2. But we complete it on a hopeful note. And that's very, very important, particularly in a forum such as this. where we spend a lot of time talking about problem, but we really need to focus very closely on solution. And we highlight a promising teaching method in the brief that is called culturally responsive education, which links schooling to culture. And we highlight several schools that are currently using culturally responsive education that were featured by the National Education Association in 2011 for their outstanding achievements with Black boys. Newark Tech in New Jersey, where 85% of the mostly Black and Hispanic students qualify for free or reduced lunch, had 100% of students graduate. 88% of these students were shown to be proficient in math, and 100% tested proficient in reading. Similarly, schools with a culturally responsive approach in Maryland's Montgomery County had a 2010 graduation rate of 83%, which is 36% above the national average for Black males. So I'm gonna finish there and pass it on to my fellow panelists, and if time permits, I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of the things that I learned in drafting this brief. Thanks.
When I was trained to become a mental health services researcher, one of the things I was taught was that when developing an intervention, to focus on mutable variables, meaning focusing on the things that are changeable, which usually distill down to individual level factors. So we're taught to develop interventions that focus on changing the individual. I never felt entirely comfortable with that approach. For example, in the work I do with people with mental illnesses leaving prison, yes, we can try to help individuals through connecting them to mental health services when they return to the community. But what good is that if they don't have a place to live? If they're excluded from getting a job because of their criminal record, when they can't get public benefits because of their substance abuse conviction? So we can't just focus on individual level factors if we're talking about long-lasting, sustainable change. We also need to focus on neighborhoods and communities and our society at large. And our next speaker brings these approaches to the work that he does. David Peters is president of DPJ Inspired Consulting, is a licensed social worker and an adjunct lecturer at the Silver School of Social Work. He's a trainer and a consultant for the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and NAFI. And after 20 years as a child welfare advocate in his role at the Research Foundation for SUNY Buffalo State, he returned to his roots as a community advocate to engage in more direct practice. During this time, he has founded or been involved in many community-based organizing activities in New Rochelle, including My Brother's Keeper, and all of these activities have been aimed at improving the outcomes for African American and Latino boys. His work focuses on addressing the effects of structural racism through an intergenerational, community-engaged, and empowerment approach. Please welcome David Peters.
Wow. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here, and to thank the McSilver Institute from NYU for having an opportunity for all of us to begin to consider and think about what Dottie really, in a really good way, framed around the impact of racism and trauma. And in particular, what I like about what Dottie was talking about was to remind us that this is a multi-generational historical process that has been going on since the birth of our nation. And with respect to that particular process, we have created a nation, more so today, quite frankly, than in many, many years, where we have individuals and communities who have, and we have individuals and communities who do not have. And the idea, as Stacy mentioned, that we seem to frame our thought processes and our interventions and our services to treat the individual, when in fact, as coming from the People's Institute, one of the things that we talk about, quite frankly, is that communities don't necessarily suffer because of the lack of services. They suffer because of the lack of power. And so one of the areas in which I've decided to devote my time to is around beginning to think through and to think about what are the systemic ways in which power can be unleashed within communities at large, particularly neighborhoods of people of color, particularly in neighborhoods where historically decisions have been made that have impacted their ability to intersect and interact, both in the field of education, within housing, around areas of food insecurity, and have some way of being effectively engaged in that process to begin to have more determination around who comes out, who comes in, what services would we like to have. So in part, what I'd like to talk a little bit about is the whole area of community engagement and from the context of probably 2 points of view. One will be around the area of legitimacy, as we've been talking quite a lot about over the last several months with respect to our law enforcement police departments and their impact within communities. And in addition to that, to talk a little bit about how communities can begin to create leverage, if you will, by having a more of a race analysis perspective in thinking about what's going on in their lives. You know, we're not necessarily taught through our educational system to think about race at an early age in the context of an analysis that is one that really begins to look at how we have evolved and how we continue to move forward. So for example, when we think about cases in education and we think about Plessy versus Ferguson, I believe Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1800s essentially was a Supreme Court decision that reinforced the ideological idea of separate but equal after the Emancipation Proclamation. You fast forward another 100 years or so and the next sort of federal activity, which again speaks to our national narrative, was Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education was intended to begin to try to support the idea, the ideology that we wanted to begin to have an integrated educational system. One, through the integration of that educational system, would create and leverage the sort of community of education in which people would begin to be able to learn and grow effectively together. When you fast forward to 2015 and the world view of 2015, and you begin to think about how we are forming ourselves as a nation, more and more, Jim Crow has been replaced by the demographics of housing. We are living more and more in separate places with respect to the race construct. Race construct being individuals who have come to be called white and individuals from the standpoint of people of color. The largest minority in public school education in relationship to the student demographics currently is the white student. And I don't think we think a lot about that more and more white students are not engaged and involved from kindergarten through high school as they had been before. So in effect, what are we talking about? We're talking about an educational system where Brown versus the Board of Education no longer really is the tipping point for where we can begin as a society to look at ourselves as moving forward in an effective way. We're talking about a system where Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, 200 years ago or so, is actually no longer in place either. We're talking about an educational system in which resources are far from equal. Students in schools are separated more than ever before. And the idea of the achievement gap, both in terms of minimal requirements, but more importantly as well, in terms of the excellence gap, is growing further and further apart. So as you begin to consider that and think about that, I think it's important for us to begin to understand that there are structural, inherent reasons why these systems are being designed and supported in the way in which they currently are. One of the things that I, as well as others, have attempted to do was to think about how can we begin to address some of the questions that I'm raising now. And so from the context of engaging the community, some of the things that we've begun to do is to utilize sort of from the school to prison pipeline. We took Michelle Alexander's book and we decided to open it up to the neighborhoods and to the communities and have a book study. And out of that book study, there were a number of people who came. People who, in the particular city in which I live, in which I decided to participate in an organizing way, these individuals would come out both white, black, Latina, young, old, to examine the new Jim Crow as a point of reference in thinking about this issue. We then decided as a group that we were going to continue to do this, and so with respect to that, I then began to, from the standpoint of organizing and beginning to start a sense of a race analysis, to begin to offer them some of the way in which the whole construct of race has been developed. What did it mean? How did it come into being? How has it been maintained? Began to talk a little bit about something that, from the People's Institute standpoint, we call internalized racial oppression. Simply meaning that it's a multi-generational process that's a dehumanizing process through which people of color begin to view their world in many different ways through the eyes of the oppressor. Because what has not changed is what I started out before, people who are more privileged and have more, and people who have less. And so with regards to that, over a period of time, there are continual ways in which this internalization of expectations, of relationships, of the sense of some of the dynamics that exist both psychologically and socially that individuals begin to develop and are maintained through the systemic ways in which institutions structurally interact and intersect in communities' lives. But we also began to take a look at the second side of that coin, which is internalized racial superiority, which oftentimes is talked about in the context of people who have come to be called white, with respect to being engaged and involved in a system that historically, from the standpoint of a national narrative, was created for, by, and to be maintained in our systems and through our structures, primarily for people who are white. And so although it's a system that we've inherited, it is still a system in which we exist and are maintained today. So the question becomes, how do we as a community begin to address the multi-generational patterns of behavior that are associated with structural beliefs and the way in which systems function, in a way in which we can begin to leverage a different point of view to bring about the concept that we are more often than not interested in, which is racial equity. Racial equity is a concept that is intended to create an atmosphere and opportunities by which one's color in relationship to their race ought not in any way impact or make decisions around their availability of being available and engaged more in our nation and in our national society. So with respect to those two particular sort of anchor points, structural racism and racial equity being the goal, those are the places in which part of the race analysis within communities needs to, from my point of view, ought to occur in terms of thinking about that. So when I think about trauma, that happens within communities, the historical thing that is going on now and has always happened is this sense of legitimacy with respect to communities and the way in which they are oftentimes policed. Police being all forms in which the criminal justice system rolls itself out in many of these communities, which we know through our data tells us that there's a disproportionate number of African American people, in addition to Latina, and in addition to the Native American, depending upon where you may be in any given context. And so with regards to that, when you're engaged and involved in these things, some of the things that I've learned, for example, is as a consultant, I'm involved in a community initiative whereby I bring together police departments here in the state of New York and youth to begin to enter into a conversation that essentially relates to the legitimacy of the police within their community and what it means. And more often than not, the trauma that comes up associated with this context of a multi-generational structural independence is that more than ever before, many of the youth, who are probably 98% throughout the state of New York, Black and Latino youth, male and female, will say with respect to their goals, that one of the goals that they have is that when they grow up and become adults and have their own families, that they want to be a better man than their father. And in that context, that's very problematic, because what we're beginning to see and beginning to experience is a sense of hopelessness. And hopelessness is a multi-generational process that is part of the continuation of racist structures that exist within this country. So as you begin to have hopelessness as an internalized racial dynamic, you begin to have individuals from that standpoint and communities who feel that they have to tolerate the circumstances in which they are currently engaged and live in. So the idea is to begin a process of community education, a process around the race construct, a process that begins to take people through the differences through data that tells us the differences in relationship to how particular things, how particular situations, how particular circumstances have evolved. Because you cannot begin to change systemic racism if you aren't, first of all, aware of what it is, who it affects, how it's been impacted, and how it continues to be maintained. This is a process that from my experience in working in communities, is one in which you want to begin to sort of lay a foundation that is intended to also be applied over time. So you want to begin to meet on a regular basis. So what I found is that within communities, we meet on a regular basis. What I ask for in going into communities is that we begin to establish weekly meetings that begin to unpack the racial dynamic, both in terms of individuals. So for example, in any of our groups, and we always have people who are white, people who are Latino, people who are Asian, depending upon the community, there's always this sense of people wanting to break off into their natural groups, if you will. And so we always say, no, you can't have a group. You got to have a white person in that group. You got to have a black person in that group. So the idea of understanding language becomes very important. Because language, without having a consistency of language, you cannot have a consistency of beginning to be able to move forward in understanding racism. So I've gotten a sign that I need to begin to wrap up. And so from that particular framework, hopefully at some point we'll have a further conversation. If not today, another point in time. Thank you.
So far, we've explored the broader definition of racism that takes into account the structural level factors and about the effects of this type of racism in communities and strategies to overcome the effects of this type of racism. But now we're going to change gears just a little bit. And I want to talk a little bit about a study I'm conducting right now. I'm talking to men and women who have had contact with the mental health and the criminal justice systems and are currently working as peer support specialists in the city in a variety of settings. And what I'm learning through these conversations is that there's a real importance of using their own personal experiences in helping others who are experiencing similar circumstances. But even more importantly, their work as peer providers is really important to their own healing and recovery. And being able to come to use their experiences in their work and feel like they're contributing to society is a really powerful and healing event. And our last speaker will give voice and meaning to these experiences and the personal effects of trauma and racism. Sharon Weiss has a master's in human services and is a certified peer specialist. She's a philanthropist and trauma expert, and she uses this expertise to enlighten and teach others about the effects of trauma and how to heal through the use of visual and performing arts. She's the recipient of many, many awards, well-deserved, and distinctions, including the 2012 National Council for Behavioral Community Health Award. And I know she's going to teach us all something today. It's my pleasure to introduce Sharon Weiss.
First, I want to thank the McSilver Institute for inviting me, and definitely thank the attendees. I was privileged enough to be sitting downstairs during the not fire drill. Okay, and someone said, we came here because of this panel. We wanted to hear what you all had to say. Normally when I come out on the song Happy by Pharrell, but I don't have that today, and it's primarily because I was just at a psychiatrist conference, and I was telling them that I usually come out on that song, and it was 4 or 5 of the psychiatrists sitting right there with me, and they said, well, are you happy? Are you sometimes happy? Are you happy under these situations, A, B, or C? And I said, they have not heard that song. So they don't know what the hell I'm talking about, you know. So let me just stop right there. And then I was listening to some of the people that were speaking before, and what it reminded me of was what happened to me when I was incarcerated. Was one day I woke up and I said, damn, I'm incarcerated. And then the other thing came to my mind was, damn, I committed a crime. That's why I'm incarcerated. You know, that light bulb had to come on. So as I go through my presentation, the 12 minutes I've been honored to get, I'm going to give you a non-traditional version of racism as trauma. And it has a lot to do with the self-responsibility that I had to take on myself so I could stop being involved in some of these systems so that somebody can say that I'm traumatized because I'm black. No, I traumatized the hell out of a bunch of y'all when I stole y'all pocketbook and y'all, broke in your car. That may have traumatized some people too. And then the first thing I want to say is you locked me up because I'm black. You took my kids because I'm black, and then you did a whole lot of other things to me because I'm black. I had to look at the fact that when you get on an airplane, they have 3 minutes to prepare you for takeoff. And within the 3 minutes, out of everything that they could tell you on that plane, they tell you to put your mask on first if you need some help. If the cabin pressure drops, before you help somebody next to you, Sharon, you put your mask on first. So what does that mean? That means that until I helped the dummy, I wasn't able to even begin to empower my community because I had not addressed my own trauma. So when we think about historical trauma, we think about intergenerational trauma, even when we think about some of the things that's happening in the media right now, well, I am here to report. People will go across the country to address this issue, but won't go across the street to help some kids. People will go and juggle their rent money to go and protest in Ferguson, and we'll see Ray Ray break in my damn house and won't say nothing. You see, so for me, when I think about this issue, I think about the self-responsibility of the people that it's affecting. Okay, y'all got all this research and all of these. Okay, that they building jails based on kindergarten scores. So that means we got to do some front-end loadings. Let's increase those kindergarten scores. So I wanted to kind of say that, real quick, that if Black Lives are mattering, if they say Black Lives Matter, that it's a campaign, what about the Black Lives mattering to the Black lives? Because somehow we got to step up and we have to say, wait a minute, yes, the system is designed to do this and all that slavery, all these things that happen to us and black people, the disparities here and there and the other. But then if you come in my neighborhood, it's like they don't care about your research. They don't care that there is numbers telling us that some things are going to happen to us and we're not going to get jobs and we're not going to get this and that, because of all of these different disparities. And guess what? The people in my neighborhood are still participating in crime. Now, people could say, well, it's because, the systematic school system and they didn't have the right education. That's what I thought when I was shooting dope in my neck. That's what I thought when I gave my kids away. That's what I thought, when I robbed somebody with a friend of mine and ran down the street and then got shot. That's what I was thinking. That somehow it was because I was black, until I took some responsibility for myself. So y'all have to excuse me because I can't sit down. You all can start the video. And what you all are going to see is you're going to see a lot of my art. And they talked about the fact that, I had to heal through my art because for a long time I didn't have the words. I was the 5-year-old in the hospital. I was the 9-year-old that was cutting. I was the child whose mother told me that she did not want me. The thing that my mother used to say to me all the time was she tried to abort me when she was 4 months pregnant. So therefore, I didn't get the nurturing that I probably should have gotten. So what happens for me is, when we think about trauma, remember, this is one thing I want you all to keep on your mind. When we talk about trauma, we're not talking about the incident. We're talking about people's response to it. Me and you could be in the same fender bender, just a little bump in the back of the car, and what happens? You get up and go to work the next day, I can't. Because of my unaddressed trauma, the things that happened to me when I was 9 and 10 years old. They trying to find my video. So we got the lights turned down low a little bit. So if somebody want to get them a nap, you better go ahead. Because the light's going to be turned up directly. So what happened is I started to internalize this thing, when people would say, this black little girl, her mother didn't want her, so I end up in foster care. And as a direct result of me ending up in foster care and going around people who didn't really want me, that was not uncommon. So some of the first pictures that you all are going to see, are you going to see the pictures when I was locked up, when I've been in prison several times. Been in mental hospitals, institutions, all this kind of stuff because of my unaddressed trauma. So the pictures look a little dark, and if you need to take care of yourself or you need to cry, go ahead and do it. Because remember, you have to put your mask on first. And until us miracle workers, and the reason why I'm calling you a miracle worker is because I know I'm a miracle. I know that all the hell that I've been through in my lifetime, whether I was black, female, had a big bush black dress on and pearls, you could blame it on anything you want. But I had to take some responsibility. You know, I had to stop shooting dope to get off drugs. You know, I had to go to parenting class to learn how to be a good parent so I can get my children back. See, I had 2 children by the time I was 17 years old. So that meant that I was still in foster care, and now my children are in foster care. So when we talk about historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, that's a snapshot on what it could look like. But let me tell you something about resiliency, that people are born resilient. Sometimes they say that we're born like gold. If you take a newborn baby out the womb and you hold that newborn baby up, make sure you do it in a safe environment, or don't try this at home. You know, it's not only a movie. And so you hold that baby up out the womb, the baby is going to constrict itself because it doesn't want to fall. Now, mind you, the baby don't know what falling is. So that lets you know that there's something in our DNA that says, I want to live. But then we are affected by our adverse childhood experiences. And I'm sure y'all heard about the ACE study. It tells you about the prevalence. And if you have an ACE score of 4 or more, the prevalence or the likelihood of you doing this, that, and the third, shooting dope, committing suicide, attempting it, or doing all these other things, that the likelihood, the higher your ACE score, the likelihood you are goes up. Guess what, folks? There was only 10 questions, and Sharon Weiss had an 8. So as a direct result of that 8, my life was littered with jails, institutions, all kind of violence, all kind of self-harm. Guess what? They used to put cigarette butts out on me when I was a kid, so I started doing it. But then I had to stop. But it took miracle workers like you all. It took the scientists. That's why we're hearing so much about trauma now. We finally got the scientists on board. And now that the scientists on board, and they're telling you, guess what? It does something to your brain. The frontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala are all affected. And let me tell you something, just because my brain is smaller, according to Dr. DeBellis, you know, it didn't atrophy, my ventricles, all that stuff is smaller. You know, because every time you see white on the MRI, guess what? That's space. But it didn't stop me from being a recognized artist all over the world. My art is hanging. And even though I've been restrained and secluded 13 times in and out of penitentiaries, had all my fingers broken, my nose and my shoulders while in hospitals, you know, being force medicated, you know, I have resiliency. So even though trauma or racism or, you know, racism as trauma or trauma as racism, or rather we want to say, why did the chicken cross the road, or was the car before the horse? Oh, it's all about the responsibility of those affected by the problems that we're talking about today. And until we start putting our mask on first, or let me say it like this, until I stopped being a part of the problem and started becoming a part of the solution, you know, my life didn't change. Now, mind you, Martin Luther King said something very, very important. He said something related, I'm just paraphrasing it. He goes on to talk about this creative force. He said, as my suffering mounted, you know, he looked at all the things that was happening. He said, as my suffering mounted, there was 2 ways in which I could respond. Either I could respond with bitterness, or I could use that bitterness and turn it into a creative force. See, it was all about a decision that I had to make. It wasn't made for me. Y'all tried to make it for me. You tried to make it for me when you took my children and I went before the judge with my blonde hair and blue eyes. Yes, I had a blonde wig on and some blue contact lenses that I had stole, so I couldn't see out of them. Everybody thought I had Parkinson's. And I remember the judge saying, ma'am, before we legally, because I lost all parental rights to my children. They said, before we adopt your children out, ma'am, is there anything you want to say, or do you know where the children's fathers are? Maybe we could place the children with the father. I told that judge, you might be the father. And he said, give her 90 more days. You know, and in them 90 days, I had a spiritual awakening. You know, and I knew I didn't want to go back to jail no more, so I stopped doing things to get me there. so I can stop being a part of this prison system that's got all these disparities going on. Hell, I don't want to be up in there and there's all them disparities going on. My coupon is expired at Macy's. I got a whole lot of more problems, right? And I started looking at my life different, and as I started to look at my life different and started to come into partnership with those people that was trying to help me, my life began to change. And guess what? I got both of my children back. I got my son back about 15 years ago. He's 35. I know I look good, but he is 35. And I just found my daughter on Facebook 5 years ago. She was 27. But guess what? If I didn't ever get out the penitentiary and get off of drugs, I wouldn't have been concerned about no Facebook or none of that stuff. You know, if I didn't start to have some kind of hope, you know, and tap into that resiliency. Remember I told y'all about that baby? You know, until I started going back into, you know, coming back to myself. You know, the gentleman, the president, he talked about that human experience and, you know, spirituality and us opening up this trauma field and looking at alternatives to treating trauma. You know, if that's what we're talking about. If we're talking about when people have these different experiences, you know, not just the incident, but that person respond, making sure we wrapping services around them. Because that's what helped me. In 1989, when I got out of prison for the last time, they wrapped services around me. First time in my life I ever had mental health services, substance abuse services, parenting, everything wrapped around me when I came home. And that's what stopped a lot of my traumatic experiences so I could stay out the system. I had to start putting my mask on first. You know, and I know maybe a lot of people may not agree, you know, with some of these things that I'm saying, but the reason why I'm even saying them is because I was the one that y'all was treating. You know, I was the one under the bridge. I was the one, you know, hitting all these different systems. Now I'm going around changing systems that let y'all know that then I'm still black. I ain't changed nothing. So how is it possible? You know, it means that we have to start stepping up, folks. We have to start empowering people, and then the people who we're empowering have to start accepting the empowerment so that they can empower others. That's where that peer support came in at. That therapeutic value of one person helping another being without parallel. Each one teach one. Yes, brother. Yes, each one teaching one. And so I know I may have a few more minutes, but these are my beautiful children y'all just saw that's hugging their mama because I had to put my mask on first. And I'm going to stop right there. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.